So before we get started, we actually need to download something. This is Xnode. Xnode is an open source library that allows us to render these node graphs, which are pretty cool. So there are multiple ways to actually get this into your project. You could just go up here and download it. The second place would be to go to the asset store and use it here. But as you can see, in the asset store version isn't free, which doesn't mean that the project itself isn't free. It is open source, so you can just download it and use it without any issues. The third version of obtaining this library is by actually using Unity's package manager. Now, for that to work, you actually need to have Git installed. If you don't know how to use Git, maybe you just should download the zip. If you know what Git is, just copy the URL of this Git repository that you can get by clicking on code. And then you go to Unity, Window, Package Manager, and then up here in the top left, you can say add package from Git URL. You can then go add this over here, and then you can import it using the package manager, just as you would with any Unity package or any package that you would get from the asset store. And once you've done that, it should actually appear in your packages folder. In our code, the first thing we are going to do is to go to our editor directory, and we can actually get rid of our dialog editor. The reason behind that is that we are going to use our node graph to edit our dialog completely, so we won't need a separate dialog editor anymore. In our dialog segment class, we're going to make a couple of changes. Our dialog is going to be still composed of these segments, but the segments themselves are going to be nodes in the graph. So to do that, we actually need to make some changes. First of all, we need to inherit from Xnode node. As you can see, I'm using this class up here, this namespace. Then we can get rid of our constructor over here. We can also get rid of this list, which is not going to be needed anymore. So we're pretty much only left with the data that we actually want to display in our dialog. We have this dialog text and we have these answers. So for our dialog, we need to define ports, inputs and outputs. And each port needs to have a data type. Since we don't really want to pass something into our node, we need to define some sort of dummy type. So what I did is just define a serializable struct, which we are going to call connection. We then can add a connection input field into our node by just saying connection input. And then we need to actually mark it as an input by using Xnode's input attribute. Now for our answers, we can actually reuse our list that we have here. We want to be able to determine to which new node in the graph we jump by coupling it to the answers we choose. So using the answer for our output is a good choice. What we have to do here is to define it as an output. But since we have a list of answers, we actually need to be able to dynamically add and remove output ports. Now, fortunately, Xnode has us covered. To do that, all we need to do is actually define it as a dynamic port list, which we can do like this. Now, one thing we need to do, because otherwise we would be getting some notices, so we need to override a method that the node class has, which is called getValue. Now, this is used if you want to do some sort of computation in your node. For example, if you would make like a scriptable blueprint style of visual scripting solution, you could use this to compute a value. But in our case, we only use inputs and outputs to determine the flow of stuff. We don't really pass data around, So we don't really need to do anything in this method. As you can see, changing the dialog segment code has actually introduced some errors in our dialog window. This is going to be the case for a while, and since Unity won't let us compile our code with errors, we are just going to comment out the code of this class for now, because we are going to work on the node editor mostly for the beginning of this tutorial. And once we've done with editing the nodes, we will come back to this class and display them. Next up, we can actually remove our scriptable objects here. Our dialog segment inherits from node, which makes it scriptable objects in itself. Xnode actually uses scriptable objects to store all the nodes. So we don't really need this anymore to wrap all our dialog segments, so we can just delete it. What we need is a new class, which we are calling dialog graph. Now, a graph in Xnode is the containing object that contains all of our nodes. This needs to inherit from node graph, which is a class in Xnode, and we need to add a create asset menu. With these changes, we should now be able to actually create our asset. So let's just go to this directory here, say create dialog graph. Now we have this window here, and then we can say add dialog system script dialog segment. And as you can see, we already can set our dialog text and our answers. We can even create a second option and connect those, which is already pretty much all the functionality we need. But as you can see, this doesn't look very good. I mean, it looks kind of cool, but we have a little bit of space issues here. So what we can do is actually customize the rendering of these nodes by overriding some methods and adding some classes. That's what we're going to do next. To customize our node editing, we need to add a class into our editor folder. We're going to call this class Dialog Node Editor. Pretty straightforward. This class is going to inherit from Node Editor, which is in the Xnode editor namespace. We need to mark it as a custom node editor for our dialog segment. And now, if we look actually in our node editor class, we can see that there's like a lot of methods in here that we can override. We are going to focus on the onBody override methods, which we can just onBody GUI method, which you can just override like this. Now, the stuff we're going to do in this class can seem a little bit complicated, so I would like to show you how I actually worked out how this stuff works, so you can go into Xnode's code and learn this stuff yourself, because this stuff has a lot specific Xnode related code, which, to be honest, you can't just get that stuff out of thin air, right? And the documentation on that part is deliberately thin by the author, because he likes to get people to actually browse this code. So yeah, that's what I did. So what I did, I was just looking at the implementation that he actually had for the onBody GUI. And as you can see, there isn't a lot of stuff going on here. He just iterates over all these properties and then renders the property fields, and then he does the same stuff for ports. Now, what we actually need to change are two things. First of all, we're going to make this dialog text a little bit bigger. And as you can see, now that we've actually overwritten the class, it disappears. And we're going to make the dialog text appear a little bit bigger. And then we are going to edit the dynamic list of answers and make those texts appear a little bit bigger. But you've also realized now that we're having a little issue, because once we override this method, we pretty much have to recreate all of this stuff that is rendered on our own. And that's why learning the source code comes into handy. So first of all, what we need to do is call two methods. The serialized object update and apply modified properties. To be honest, I personally don't know why we need to do this, but Yeah, the original code does it, so it's probably better to just keep with it. Now what we are going to do is render our input node, port, our input port, which we can do like this. First of all, we need to get our segment, which is just using serialized object target object as dialog segment, and then we can use the get port method. The get port method is very essential when using Xnode. You can get any value from any port. So this is input because our actually input is called input. That's the name of the variable pretty much. And later on you will see that we're also going to use answers. So keep that in mind. Next up, we are going to display our dialog text. So for that, we're going to use Unity's GUI layout, which is pretty basic. And as you remember from a previous tutorial, we actually did this to display the text. So if we now go back into Unity, we should actually see our input ports again and our updated text. Important to note in this code is that we actually need to assign this spec. Otherwise, it wouldn't update. So now to the dynamic output nodes. For that, we need to use what Xnode calls a dynamic port list. I'm going to copy in some code in here that is going to be necessary to work. And after I did that, we're going over it really quickly. It's not super complicated. So first of all, we're going to have a look at this method here, which is just node editor GUI layout dynamic port list. Then we have our answers. That is our field name. This is the type of the variable, which is strings, because we are using a list of strings, as you can remember here. Then we passed in our serialized object. And then we have some default values that I just copied from the original implementation. As you can remember, if you go back to the node editor, we can actually have a look at how this is done. There's also a little bit of documentation on the website and the Git repo where this stuff is actually quite well explained. We pass in a method here. This method is actually used to render each element in this dynamic list. So we're going to paste this in here as well and go through this. Now, this method is created as a callback and is called when the reorderable list is created. So first of all, we are getting this elemental height callback. This is used to just, as the name says, determine the height of each element in the list. In this case, I went with a static value of 60 because that worked out for me when I tried it. Then we have the draw element callback. Each element gets passed a couple of variables. We have these two, which are important for us. We have the rect, which is just used for rendering. And then we have the index of each element. Now, what does this mean? If we go back to our dialog segment, as you can remember, this is a list. And each of these methods is actually called for each element. So this index can be used to access the data that we need. And as you can see below here, we're actually doing this. So first of all, as we did up here, we're actually going to take our serialized object target object and cast it into our dialog segment because that's what we are working on. Then we are taking the port. As you can remember, we have this get port method, and this time we're actually concatenating the variable name with an index. This way we can access a specific port at an index in our list. So for our first port, we would be using the index 0, and then 1, and 2, and so on. So this would end up being answers space index. And it's important to leave that space, otherwise it won't work. Then we are going to render this text. Now, to do that, we access our answers list with the index that we get provided. Then we use GUI text area and we input this into there. Then last but not least, we need to render the output port. If we don't do this, we won't be able to connect our nodes. So if our port is actually available, we're going to render this. This is some code I just copied from the original. So you can just take this and copy it as you want. Now, if you remember, I actually provide all this code in form of a Git repository in my GitHub. So you don't have to type all of this on your own. You can just copy it if you want. But what this pretty much does is just it checks if this is an output, because we only want to use it with output stuff. Then we put it to the right. Otherwise, if it's an input, we put it to the left. Actually, we could just go with only this bit here, because we're only caring about outputs right now. And then we are using the node editor GUI port field method to render the port. So now that this is done, if we go back to Unity, we should actually be able, and there we have it, to add elements. And remove them. We need to click the right stuff. And we can connect them, which is pretty cool. All right. What we need to do now is to actually use our nodes in our dialog window, so we can actually use it in our game, right? So let's do this next. So back in our dialog window, if you remember, we commented out this text. We're going to put it back in, but we're going to heavily modify this whole stuff. So this is still using our old dialog class, which we no longer have. So we are just going to change this to a dialog graph to use our new dialog graph class. And then we can actually get rid of this variable and replace it with a reference to a dialog segment. Call this active segment. All right. Now what we need to do is to actually find the beginning of our dialog node. Now, there are multiple ways we could do that. For instance, we could create a new node type that we just call start, which only has an output, right? And then we go from the start into the output. What I decided to do for simplicity is just to take the first node that we find in our graph that has nothing connected to our input. This is going to be our starting point. Now, how would we do that? Well, let me show you. To do that, all we need to do is to iterate over our nodes. Now, our node graph actually has a list of nodes available, which we can use like this. Now, as you can remember, our nodes are dialog segments, and then we can do this stuff here. Node get input port, take the name, and then we can actually change if it is connected. If it is not connected, which we do here, we are going to update our dialog, and then we break out. So we take the first one that has no connection. So you need to make sure that when you create your dialog that there's only one node which has no inputs. Otherwise, it won't work. All right. Then we need to go to our answer clicked, and we're going to just comment that out for the moment. We're going to change that later on. Now let's go back to our update dialog, which is called in our start method, right? So this needs some changes. First of all, we're going to store the reference to our active segment in here. So every time we update our dialog, we are storing a new reference. Then we should be pretty much golden in here. So if we now go back to our Unity project, make sure everything compiles and play, it should actually work, which it doesn't. And that has a very simple reason, because we actually need to go to our dialog UI and make sure everything is hooked up. So first of all, we need to set up our active dialog, and then we actually need to set up our prefab for the button and our button container, which you should already have set up, but since I had to make some changes to my project, and that's why I lost all the references. All right, if we play now. Also, we need to sure to make this connection, and now, all right, now it works. Now it won't do much because the button press is not hooked up. So that's what we're going to fix next. So if we go back to our answer click method, we can actually get rid of all this code over here. And now what we need to do is we are going to get our port for the answer that we clicked. So we're going to use the active segment get port answers, and as you remember, we can just add the index. So this way we get the port for the answer that we clicked. Then we can check if this port is actually connected. Now we're going to do this check to determine if we are at the end of the sequence. What does that mean? So if we go back to our node graph, you can see that some of these answers are not connected. We want to just disable the dialog when we hit one of these answers. So these are our endpoints pretty much. So if we click one of these answers, our dialog is going to be finished. So for our simple dialog system, we are just going to call setActiveFalse on our game object. As you can remember, this code is on this dialog UI, so we will just disable this dialog UI once we reach a point in the dialog where we don't want to display the dialog anymore. In the case it is connected, we want to just receive the next node from our graph. And to do that, we are just going to call our update dialog method, which is just a method that we used here already. And we're going to go to our board, and then we can use the connection and node. Now this is a generic node type. We need to cast that to our dialog segment, so our update dialog method can work with that. By the way, you can always get rid of this options button if you still have that. And now, if we go back to Unity and play our game, we should now be able to click through our dialog. And if you wonder why the buttons were empty, it's just because we didn't have any text in here. So let's try this out. Hello, friend. Oh, actually, let's just, whoops. It's a little bit, well, I mean, it's open source, right? So it's a little bit, oh, actually, all right. How do I, yeah, it's just a little bit big. I just copied the whole code that I edited before in here. This shouldn't be doing that. Hi there. Hey. Oh. Can we actually copy nodes? It doesn't seem to be this case. But you get the point, right? We can now connect these. Now if we play the game, if I press A, we actually get to a test 3, which has no answers. Right, like so. And now it works. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Now, as you can imagine, you can now pretty much add anything you want to this. So if you want to go and add sound files or profile pictures, you could easily turn this answers array, for example, into a struct where you can also like have a sound file attached to it, or you can add like a character class for the character that is actually talking. So you have a name and you have a picture that you can display. The possibilities are pretty much unlimited. For this tutorial series, I'm going to leave it at that. I think you have the tools that you need to actually do great stuff with that. And I can't wait to read your guys' comments about what you have actually done with this cool tech. Also, make sure to head over to the Xnode GitHub and maybe give that guy a coffee, because this library is so easy to use and allows us to do so cool stuff. It's almost criminal that it's for free. All right, guys. I see you in the next one. Bye bye.